Good afternoon and welcome to all of you on this Zoom platform hosting the public lecture of the first Jesuit Heritage Summer School. A special welcome, of course, to the students and tutors of the summer school and to our keynote speaker, Professor Evonne Levy, who will be further introduced to you by Professor John Arblaster. I am really keen on hearing your talk, Professor Levy, about Jesuit architecture from a political perspective, taking into account an increasingly deconfessionalized political landscape, or maybe depolarized or unpillarized is a better word when applied to the Belgian context and maybe also in the context of architecture. My name is Stijn Latré. I'm the director of UCSIA, the University Center St. Ignatius, Antwerp, and UCSIA is co-organizer of this event. And I thank my UCSIA colleague Hilke Gunst for making this event possible. But I must say that our role in this event is rather humble, for most efforts for this summer school and also for this public lecture have been done by the Ruusbroec Institute. So I'm really grateful for our fruitful cooperation with the staff of the Ruusbroec Institute and its director Pierre Delsart, and particularly for this event also Professor John Arblaster. A fruitful cooperation it is indeed, because it extends beyond the Jesuit Heritage Summer School. UCSIA is currently preparing, in close collaboration with the Ruusbroec Institute and the University Library of the University of Antwerp, a large city festival to be held in 2023, entitled Baroque Influencers, with focus on the 16th and 17th century Jesuit culture in Antwerp, and also on the way this culture is still influencing us today. Needless to say, Jesuit architecture and imagery in general will be very present in a large exhibition during that festival year 2023. Another core activity of this festival will be the reenactment of a 17th century play by Joost van den Vondel on the historical scene in the Carolus Borromeus Church, so the formerly named St. Ignatius Church. I won't dwell too long on this topic, but allow me to share my screen with you and present you the website of the Jesuit Heritage Foundation very briefly. So I'm trying to get to the share button now. Okay, you can see there the website. That's for, of course, the Dutch-speaking audience or the Belgian residents, and maybe also the Belgian taxpayers. So you can find your way to the website jesuitenerfgoed.be just to find the information about our project, about the project also of Baroque Influencers that you find here at the bottom of the screen. But also there is a make a donation button, which is also very important for the future of the scientific work at the Ruusbroec Institute, preparing for this festival in 2023, and also to make this exhibition, this large exhibition on Jesuit image culture in Antwerp possible. So have a look at that and spread the URL in your network. Thank you. But then it's now time, I think, to stop sharing my screen, to end my talks of promotion and stop hijacking this event for promotion. So I am now happy to give the floor to Professor Arblaster.
Thank you, Stijn. It is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this public lecture of our inaugural Jesuit Heritage Summer School, Professor Evonne Levy. Evonne Levy is Distinguished Professor of Early Modern Art at the University of Toronto and an art historian who works on the global Baroque and on the intellectual history of the discipline of art history, with a particular focus on the discipline's often unspoken politics. She's the author of several monographs, Propaganda and the Jesuit Baroque, and Baroque and the Political Language of Formalism, 1845 to 1945. And she recently co-edited with Tristan Weddingen a new English translation and first critical edition of Heinrich Wölflin's Principles of Art History, The Problem of the Development of Style in Early Modern Art. Her lecture today is entitled Jesuit Architecture in the Crosshairs of Confessional Politics, and we're very honored, Evonne, for your willingness to deliver this public lecture as part of our inaugural Jesuit Heritage Summer School. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, John and Stijn, for inviting me to give the public lecture. For those of you who know my work, I'm going to be traversing some familiar territory today, but with a slight change in perspective. So with that, I will share my screen. Okay. As John noted, for several decades now, I've been investigating the political pressures that shaped key art historical concepts as they emerged, were debated, and revised. Around 20 years ago, in fact, right around 9/11 it was, and I was in Berlin at the time, just starting a fellowship with a new project. I set out to write a short monograph on one of the most overtly political of art historical terms, namely the Jesuit style, or in German, its native tongue, the Jesuitenstil. The Jesuit style as a concept referred initially to church architecture, both specific architectural forms and an attitude towards their interior decorations with their associated materials, a style that originated in 16th century Italy and persisted into the 18th century all over Europe and into Latin America. Now, I ultimately decided about a year into the project that Jesuit style was an early chapter in the history of the concept of the Baroque. And I decided to fold the historiography of the Jesuit style into that larger history. In the narrower field of Jesuit studies, though, much ink has been spilled about the Jesuit style, a concept that gave art history a voice in confessional politics. Here today, I want to present 5 protagonists, unequal protagonists, in the concept's history, with the focus on the immediate political context from which their views emerged, their own political positions. I want us to try to tap into the deep-seated beliefs, the feelings even, that animate art historical concepts. While debates about style are pretty passé now, the motivations that propel our investment in style, or in concepts, I should say, and the affect that is, in a positive way, discernible in our writings about them, are the kernels that interest me here. So we will revisit some old episodes, spend some time trying to empathize with the experiences, beliefs, and the hearts of at least 4 of these 5 figures, but at least to hear the political chatter around them and to feel their politics. So let's start at the beginning with the birth of the concept Jesuit style. In the summer of 1841, the young Jacob Burckhardt, at the time a student at the Berlin University of the famous historian Leopold von Ranke and of Franz Kugler in art history, sat in the botanical garden of Cologne and sketched. An amateur draftsman, Burckhardt only had eyes that day for the Cologne Cathedral, the glorious uncompleted work of the Gothic imagination rising up beyond garden trellises. When Burckhardt sat in the garden and looked west to the cathedral, he was likely wrapped in a kind of romantic reverie. He held this incomplete building as the pinnacle of Gothic architecture. It was considered at the time the greatest work of art of the Middle Ages, even as a half ruin, not even a fragment. He recognized it as galvanizing the national movement in Germany for its completion. This he remarked in his first work of cultural history that he wrote on Conrad von Hochstaden, the bishop under whom the cathedral was built, which he wrote for Ranke's Seminar in History. At the time Burckhardt wrote it, Germany was not yet unified as a nation, and the completion of this Gothic structure was understood by many as an effort to understand Germany as a complete nation through its cultural achievements, including the establishment of a Germanic architectural style. Looking at the incomplete building, Burckhardt and his contemporaries saw the architectural imaginary of the German nation, the uncompleted project of building a nation, and the spirit of a unified German people rising in its forms. The drawing, like many Burckhardt made of architecture over the years, did not mask its presentness. He wrote on the top right, "The cathedral seen from the botanical garden." In labeling the drawing, Burckhardt must have felt some deep satisfaction that he could sit in that garden because it was now the city botanical garden, open to all. He would have known that the garden had been part of the 17th century Jesuit college, turned over to the city and its public school system in 1773 upon the suppression of the Jesuits. Burckhardt, Swiss and of the Reformed confession, had no sympathy for the Jesuits. He was quite anti-clerical and shared the view of many Protestants that the Jesuits, in carrying the Roman counter-reformation over the Alps to Switzerland and Germany, had imposed a stifling regime on areas that had peacefully gone over to Calvinism and Lutheranism. With the French occupation of Cologne in the Napoleonic period, the garden was freed from the Jesuits and decreed in 1805 a place of instruction. That garden became an Enlightenment pedagogical instrument. Plants were arranged and cataloged according to the Linnaean taxonomic system. When the Napoleonic occupation ended in 1815, Cologne's botanical garden passed back into city hands and continued to serve as a botanical garden. The garden would be henceforth haunted by Jesuits and by French botanists. Burckhardt evoked the historical spirits that I have just placed in the garden, the Jesuits, the French. Just a few months later, in a letter to his friend, the poet Gottfried Kinkel, almost as if he recalled sitting in that garden, he wrote, "Only he who has worked in German history can have an idea of this great and heavenly Volksgeist, which walks through good and bad centuries, through flowering gardens and wild deserts, youthful, indestructible, an eternity and guarantee of future in its bosom." If Burckhardt sensed the German Volksgeist with all its hopes for the future as he looked at the Cologne Cathedral sitting in the former Jesuit garden, he was also aware of its mighty opponents, the Jesuits on the one hand and the French on the other. The affect we hear in this passage about a historian seated in a garden as the German Volksgeist passes through it is not the image familiar to us of this Swiss historian. Skeptical and anti-modern, Burckhardt famously claimed to want to place himself as a historian at an Archimedean point, at an ideal distance, just outside the melee of current events. In another letter to Kinkel from the same period, he wrote that his interest in history arose from an intense desire to explain how his own time had come about. Burckhardt confronted very current events when, just 2 years later, he assumed the position of editor of Basel's chief conservative newspaper, the Basler Zeitung, at a time that Swiss radicals were trying to move Switzerland to democratic federation amidst resistance on the part of the traditionally politically autonomous Swiss cantons. The crisis Burckhardt had to confront in 1844, the political crisis, swirled around the highly provocative invitation by the canton of Lucerne to the suppressed Jesuit order to return. Burckhardt took the position that the cantons had the right to make the choice themselves, thus not opposing the Jesuit presence in Lucerne, though Burckhardt was in fact very opposed to the Jesuits and their educational system. But as a result of having taken this neutral position towards the Jesuits, though he took a principled conservative position on cantonal independence and rights, he was fired from the newspaper. The tangle Burckhardt found himself in around the Jesuit crisis resulted in his withdrawal from the melee of current events. It was this very Jesuit episode that caused him to seek the Archimedean point away from current events. He may have resisted a directly instrumentalized writing of history. His history, though, was never conceived outside of his socio-political world. Though he sought the Archimedean point from which to view history, he never did seem to aspire to find the same neutral point from which to view art history. The Jesuit style is the example that proves just how hard it was to assume this point of objectivity in writing art history for Burckhardt. For at the very moment of the Jesuit crisis, Burckhardt wrote a short encyclopedia article on a new art historical concept, the so-called Jesuit style. It was full of the overt anti-Jesuitism and anti-clericalism that he refrained from expressing in his journalism. So let's read a bit of it. The Jesuit style in architecture and decoration designates the method of handling forms which became preeminent in Jesuit churches and institutions since the middle of the 17th century. The Jesuits were as insincere in their architecture as they were in every aspect of their spiritual life. Sorry, this doesn't conform to your version of it. They only wished to impress with them. Sorry, my slides are a little mixed up, but I'm just going to read what I have here. Initially, until the middle of the 17th century, the Jesuits held fast with an affected sincerity to the Gothic and even the Byzantine style, as their churches in Koblenz, Bonn, and Cologne demonstrate. The interiors of their buildings are decorated at times with playful splendor, full of gilding and carving. Their altars are especially colossal, mostly gilded ensembles of flowers, figures, angels, saints, and architecture, with often 3 very bad paintings stacked up above each other. From the middle of the 17th century, they practically reached the apex of church architecture, and the degenerate Italian style would now be their own realm. At the time of the height of their power, they built their largest churches, and they were for the most part made with great solidity and pomp. Very costly materials, jasper, porphyry, lapis lazuli, and so on would be preferred for decoration, above all in Italy. Ceilings, vaults, pilasters, and so forth, overloaded with the richest coffering, foliage, and festoons. But the unimaginative composition of the whole remained impoverished. The great pomp of their church style, with its inner poverty, brought all of church architecture of the time down with it, following the lead of the Jesuits, sacrificing everything, even the highest goods, to achieve raw effects. I apologize for the discordance there. Burckhardt's Jesuit style, first elaborated in this entry, was an entirely negative concept whose main themes were these: that the society authored and disseminated an architecture of ornamental excess, whose dishonest goal was persuasion. The focal point of the Jesuit style article was the Jesuit church that was at Burckhardt's back that day in the Cologne garden a few years earlier. The Jesuit church in Cologne was for Burckhardt a kind of monstrous stylistic hybrid, mixing Romanesque, Gothic, and Italianate Renaissance and Baroque elements. The Jesuit church in Cologne, in its stylistic impurity, just the opposite of the pure Germanic Gothic of the cathedral that was feet away from it, exemplified what Burckhardt's Jesuit style was about. The Jesuit style article was just the beginning of Burckhardt's lifelong struggle to reconcile himself to the ever more accepted art of the Baroque. Before the work of art, Burckhardt's objectivity failed him. He could not locate the Archimedean objective point. These works of art motivated his art history because they disrupted him politically. These politics impregnated the churches I have shown here with powerful feelings, both good and bad. Between 1887 and 1889, our second figure, Cornelius Gurlitt, patriotic Protestant and North German, published a thick trilogy of books on the Baroque and Rococo architecture of Italy, France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany, the first survey on this subject. In contrast to Heinrich Wölfflin, who wrote a contemporaneous book defining the Baroque style as exclusively Roman, Gurlitt's first preoccupation was with rescuing and defining a German Baroque as a means of substantiating a new historical narrative through architectural history in favor of a politically unified and confessionally heterogeneous modern Germany. Prior to Gurlitt's generation, the period after the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648, represented one of Germany's historic lows in her numerous failed efforts to become a unified nation. A mosaic of duchies and principalities, further fractured by the Counter-Reformation, overrun by Jesuits streaming north to recuperate territory lost to the Protestants, and by Huguenots streaming in from Holland and fleeing France, Germany would be united only in 1871. For the next 16 years, the Prussian-led government pursued Hegel's dream of a single Protestant Germany, and they pursued it with the harsh Kulturkampf that aimed to suppress Germany's Catholics. But by 1887, when Gurlitt was writing these books, the failed Kulturkampf was being dismantled. Only the expulsion of the Jesuits was not revoked. It was time for Germany to accept itself as a religiously heterogeneous nation, Catholics living beside Protestants. Gurlitt's third volume on the German Baroque, with its first 4 chapters devoted to the architecture of different confessions that were present in Germany, and then with chapters on regional Baroque styles, was written in the immediate aftermath of the Kulturkampf, when Germany began to try to understand its history as one that had led positively to this confessional diversity. In his recuperation of this moment in German history through architecture, Gurlitt was undoubtedly inspired by the great nationalist historian Heinrich von Treitschke, who began his famous history of modern unified Germany, not with Luther, but with the Peace of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War. For Treitschke, even though the German lands lay in ruins in 1648, this was the moment that Germany first looked as it would at the founding of the Second Reich in 1871, that is, as a confessionally and regionally heterogeneous nation. In defining a German Baroque architecture as a positive phenomena, Gurlitt recast Germany's Baroque facades as the first face of the modern Kulturnation. On the way to understanding how a uniquely German Baroque not only emerged, but could replace the Gothic, both as an idealized expression of Lutheranism and Germanism, Gurlitt developed a remarkably comprehensive view of the Baroque architecture of Western Europe. And I consider it one of my great gifts to art history that I actually read, digested, and explained the architecture of this trilogy. So I'm going to pat myself on the back for that. You don't have to read the whole thing. All later developments of architecture stemmed for Gurlitt from a binary opposition established in the Renaissance of a formulaic, rule-bound classical architecture of conformity that originated in the work of Palladio on the one hand, and on the other hand, an imaginative architecture that began with the highly individual work of Michelangelo. The two types were linked to principles of Catholicism and German Protestantism, respectively. Palladianism reflected the Roman exercise of authority, and in church architecture would be associated by Gurlitt with the Jesuits. Michelangelo's architecture is Protestant in spirit because of its deep interiority, its Innerlichkeit, its subjectivity. Throughout Gurlitt's trilogy, the unification of architectural form was the goal, as a visual embodiment of the political goal of national unification. Insofar as nation formation was in reality a process bound up in confessional divisions, church architecture played a central role in Gurlitt's Baroque. Now, unlike Wölfflin, Gurlitt placed the birth of Baroque architecture in Rome, but saw it as an architectural tool that was invented to serve a world power. The engine of the style was a counter-reformatory church, and Baroque architecture was used to enforce unity of belief with the diffusion of its identifiably Roman forms all over the world. And yet Gurlitt was not willing to allow the Baroque to find its expression, ultimate expression, in Italy. Why? Because there, the relationship of individual to church, of individual to state, was considered, in architectural terms, the relation between parts and wholes was faulty. He defined the Renaissance and Reformation institutional attitudes towards the individual positively as balanced and respectful, and the Baroque institutions, in contrast, as seeking the suppression of the individual, of trying to absorb the individual into a mass and by force, an entirely negative relationship. In Italy itself, Gurlitt saw the seeds of Italian political unification being laid by the princes and the papal court. And yet, with the Jesuits as authors and engineers of this literally forceful Baroque, there was something crooked about it. Gurlitt contrasted the sincerity of the communities that had built their cathedrals in the Middle Ages to the honor of God, to the inflammatory purpose of the Italian Baroque churches, with their stacking of volumes and amassing of ornament. This insincerity of the Baroque, Gurlitt argued, was the essential aesthetic property of one of the inaugural works of the Baroque in Rome. Even though Gurlitt favored the willful individualism of Michelangelo, he had to admit that the most politically successful nations, those with either the virtue of political centralization like France or of law like England, had actually preferred classicism. Hence, the initial polarity would become much more complicated in his books. To give one example, Gurlitt characterized Catholic Belgium by its Romanness. It's by its submission to authority and its Jesuit cosmopolitanism. And yet, he was compelled to explain how an authentic Baroque had in fact established itself in Belgium. He interpreted the autonomy of the freestanding columns you see here on the middle story of the facade of the Begine Church in Brussels by Lucas Feder, for example, as a sign of the essential independence of the Belgians, who learned from the international Jesuits, but remained themselves. This is less a weakness in Gurlitt's position against the Jesuit-dominated land, and more of an expression of his admiration for modern Belgium's successful bid for independence in 1831. Now, the Jesuit style is most fully treated in Gurlitt's trilogy in the opening chapter chapter dedicated to it in the third volume on the German Baroque. Aware of the many lexicon definitions descending from Burckhardt's Brockhaus entry on the Jesuitenstil that continue to whittle down Burckhardt's original statement, Gurlitt reconceived the Jesuit style as a principle of the imposition of a rule-bound architecture, an architecture that lacks spontaneity. So he rejected part of Burckhardt's definition of the tomb as centered on overwhelming ornament. The results of the principle of imposition on architecture were negative because Gurlitt believed that true art could only arise from an inwardly felt system of belief. He positioned the Jesuit style as a kind of supplement in the architectural polis, carefully defining it and demarcating its scope so that he could locate a true German spirit in other architectural productions of the time, both Catholic and Protestant alike. So if the Jesuits were the bad Catholics in Germany, where were the good Catholics? Well, in the Prague Jesuit Church of San Nicolai, Germanists triumphed over Jesuitism, where finally a German architect, Christoph Dientzenhofer, authored a Jesuit church. Thus, even this Jesuit church was discussed in the chapter on the Catholic Baroque style, because the Dientzenhofer family's work showed that in the late 17th century in Prague, the German spirit gained in power. It suppressed the Italian who had built for the Czechs. And this was carried off by a family, Gurlitt pointed out, that had very close Italian, even Jesuit ties. Read together, the positive chapter on the Catholic Baroque and the negative one on the Jesuit style in Gurlitt's book corresponded to distinctions that were being made in post-unification Germany as a result of the divisiveness of the 1864 papal syllabus of errors and the vote on papal infallibility in 1870 between old Catholics who declared their loyalty to Germany and new Catholics who remained loyal to Pope and Rome as the syllabus demanded. In other words, with his Jesuit style chapter, Gurlitt produced a parallel structure to the old Catholic, new Catholic movement of his own day, separating Catholics loyal to Germany from Catholics loyal to Rome. There were, the Dientzenhofer proved, authentic German Catholics. The Jesuit style thus served as a foil to the Catholic Baroque, as a kind of container for all that was negative about international Catholicism, so that German Catholicism could play a positive role in the history of German architecture. Now, I've described the political confessional systematicity of Gurlitt's comprehensive interpretation of Baroque architecture. But behind the system was an ardently beating Protestant German heart, love of fatherland, and a political philosophy fundamentally shaped by his family history, insofar as the Gurlitt family itself strongly mirrored Germany's confessional heterogeneity. Gurlitt's father, Louis Gurlitt, a painter, was a Protestant who married twice outside his confession. His second marriage to Julie Berger from Mannheim was opposed by his parents, as she was Catholic. He assured her parents that Lutheran Mannheimers were tolerant and that mixed marriages were becoming a daily occurrence. Yet 1 year later, when Julie fell mortally ill in Rome, a Catholic priest who came to her bedside was not tolerant. Louis Gurlitt blamed the fanatical monk he referred to in letters for so frightening her for the fate of her soul that he caused her death. It is said that he bore a grudge against the Catholic Church for the rest of his life. Louis Gurlitt's third wife and the mother of Cornelius was Elisabeth Lewald, a convert to Protestantism from Judaism. In the late 1880s, the Gurlitt family itself, a blended family, was truly a mosaic of Germany's confessions. And Cornelius's history of German Baroque architecture carries the perspective not only of political events and historical accounts, but of lived family history, of family traumas, and the overcoming of confessional divisions through love. It is no wonder that the telos of his architectural history is the unification of the confessions. Gurlitt lived that principle. He saw and felt it in architecture, and he brought it into art history with enormous feeling and conviction. Now, this next episode revolves around the Austrian-born Nazi dictator, obviously not a historian, an art historian, but a very prominent receiver of art historical opinion. We know that Hitler studied art and was very interested in architecture. In one of his recorded evening conversations, recorded during the war, he made the following surprising, positive remark about Jesuit architecture. He said, "When all is said, we should be grateful to the Jesuits. Who knows if, but for them, we might not have abandoned Gothic architecture for the light, airy, bright architecture of the Counter-Reformation. In the face of Luther's efforts to lead an upper clergy that had acquired profane habits back to mysticism, the Jesuits restored to the world the joy of the senses." End quote. Now, there's no reason to take this as anything more than a personal and unofficial view. It clearly stands in stark contrast to the official stripped down classicism that characterized the National Socialist building program. And it is a notable departure from both the general Nazi antipathy for Catholicism and from the more specific position on Jesuit art articulated by one of Hitler's ideologues, Alfred Rosenberg, who followed most of the art historical tradition that judged Jesuit architecture negatively for going against a German way of building. Casual and brief as it was, Hitler's remark carries the political story of the term with it. And as I've said on another occasion, I don't want to attribute originality or insight to this highly derivative remark. Hitler was not a trained architectural historian, but he is echoing widely held views of a fairly style literate culture. On the one hand, he's echoing the influential view voiced by Heinrich Heine in the 1830s, that while Luther's spiritualism was the true essence of German Christianity, it had also shut down the senses and shut down art with it. In his glowing portrayal of Jesuit architecture, Hitler was not following Heine, who was quite anti-Jesuit, but the Viennese Catholic polemicist Alfred Ilg, who was amongst the first to advocate in the late 19th century for the Catholic Baroque in general and Jesuit style in particular. It was Ilg who had been the first to flip Burckhardt's invective and to declare that the Jesuits had, thank God, invented the Baroque themselves. The remark is therefore both derivative and an outlier, and I don't want to try to find consistency by reconstructing Hitler's views or dubious feelings. I do have some thoughts, though, about how he might have arrived at this opinion through his early experience of Jesuit architecture in Vienna, and especially in Linz, where he grew up. The Linz Jesuit Church, a bright space with splashes of color, bore out Hitler's positive association of Jesuit architecture with the joy of the senses. It's not so much bigger or more interesting or better than Linz's Carmelite church, but it was more important because it served as Linz's cathedral from 1785 to 1909, including in the decade that Hitler lived in Linz. The Jesuit church is just off the Franz Josef Platz, later Adolf Hitler Platz, and is visible as if it were on the square in many images of it, like the photographs that documented Hitler's proclamation of the Anschluss on March 12, 1938, from the balcony of the Linz Rathaus in front of the Trinity and Immaculate Conception column, with the Jesuit church looming behind it. But during Hitler's youth, Linz continued to build a new cathedral to replace the Jesuit church as the city's foremost place of cathedral worship, the Maria Empfängnis Dome, a neo-Gothic building that was designed by the very prominent neo-Gothic architect Vincent Staats, a builder with impeccable neo-Gothic credentials, having been in from the ground level on the rebuilding of the Cologne Cathedral. And he's the author of this amazing watercolor, imagining the completed Cologne Cathedral. The Linz Cathedral the new one was begun in 1862. The nave was under construction in the first decade of the 20th century, the years that Hitler spent in Linz. As a child, I imagine him wandering about the massive building site, one of the largest ground plans of a church in Europe. And perhaps he was many of almost all the Austrian children who contributed their Kleingeld to the cathedral's construction, as referred to in a 1924 guidebook of the cathedral. Although the church was only fully complete in 1935, Hitler would have seen parts of it where services were held before it was finally completed in 1935. And certainly he would have seen the completed work after 1935. It's a high Gothic style pile with a very dark interior. And I contrast here my photograph compared to a professionally lit photograph of the cathedral. I did take mine on a very, very sunny day in Linz, and it was very striking how dark it was. Before it became the Neue Dome, the former Jesuit church, St. Ignaz, had acted as Linz's dome, as I said. So Hitler was in Linz at a period when the Roman-inspired Catholic Baroque was being directly compared to the Gothic, because people were using both spaces and were comparing how they felt in them. Hitler's preference for the Jesuit Baroque over the Gothic may well reflect the implicit comparison between the two that he experienced in his youth. It seems really to have had something to do with how these bright Jesuit churches, which would have been confirmed by the Jesuit churches in Vienna and in Munich, where he later spent significant time, may have made him feel. Our fourth figure is Carlo Galassi Paluzzi, who was known as the founder in 1925 of the Institute of Roman Studies, an organization that published a Journal of Roman Studies and organized many research projects on the history of Rome and its artifacts. The Institute was not officially tied to the fascist regime, but ardently supported its goals and was funded by it. Galassi Paluzzi, who was considered in 1940 by Mussolini for the position of state minister, was forced to step down in 1944 from the institute he founded because of his alignment with the regime. The institute's program, as directed by Galassi Paluzzi, a devout Catholic and learned populist, was distinctive in attempting to find a synthesis between fascist and Catholic ideologies, a way of responding to the political religion of Hitler through the study and glorification of the myth of Christian Rome. The Institute supported an anti-modern Catholic view, and especially after the Lateran Pact that reconciled the fascist state with the Catholic Church, frequently attacked historically anti-Roman entities, including the Reformation, the Protestant spirit, individualism, positivism and liberalism. In 1951, and here I get to the point, Galassi Paluzzi first chronicled the history of the Jesuit style concept in detail in the provocatively titled book, The Secret History of the Jesuit Style. The title alluded to and mocked the accusations of conspiracy that swirled for centuries around the Jesuits. The Secret History was a very thorough, learned, and sophisticated account of 100 years of German, French, and Italian art historical literature. In it, he traces different phases of the concept. A first phase, which was driven by German Protestant scholars, held that the Germans had invented and insidiously disseminated a style of architecture and decoration that seduced the senses, and which was anti-Catholic in substance. This corresponds to Burckhardt's concept. The second phase, which resonates with Gurlitt's view in part, shifted to a more psychological intent to persuade, to propagandize. After World War II, Galassi Paluzzi shows the concept to have been disproven through more scientific art history. In tone and substance, Galassi Paluzzi's book is highly polemical and a confessionalized account. The first, to my knowledge, to do open battle against the Protestant lens of much of the German historiography. Galassi Paluzzi's own view was that Jesuits were not conscious creators of a style, but were nonetheless powerful catalyzers, shapers, co-creators, and interpreters of Counter-Reformation or Baroque art, indeed, even of a cultural Jesuit style. For Galassi Paluzzi, the problem with the Jesuit style was the idea of the premeditated organization of a style of architecture as a means of conquest. But in the end of the book, Galassi Paluzzi rethreads the needle, effectively reinstating the Jesuit style, but rewritten by Catholics as a positive style. As he himself admits, this whole discussion shows that the battles of confessionalization that date to the company's very founding were still very much alive. Now, our final figure, Rudolf Wittkover, is one of many post-war art historians who strategically read the politics out of Galassi Paluzzi's book, extracting its conclusion that the Protestant-driven Jesuit style was erroneous. Educated in Germany, a veteran of the Italian archives, Wittkover, of Jewish origins, left Nazi Germany in 1933 for England, where he worked at the Ruusbroec Institute. Eventually, he moved to Columbia University in New York, and it was there that he teamed up with Irma Jaffe, who taught at Fordham, a Jesuit university in New York, to organize a conference with an accompanying volume, Baroque Art, the Jesuit Contribution. From the title alone, you can see that Wittkover absorbed Galassi Paluzzi's point that the Jesuits contributed to, but did not organize the Baroque. His adjudication of the Jesuit style problem appears like the product of a completely reasonable positivist sifting of the evidence. He took all of the compulsion and conniving out of the Jesuit style by characterizing what the Jesuits did as a strategy in artistic matters, governed by a loose feeling of what our buildings should be like. Unlike Gurlitt, he didn't see a uniformity or rules, but a certain degree of stylistic conformity. And he concluded that the artists may have influenced the Jesuits where style was concerned more than vice versa. This last judgment, though not entirely original, was especially important. Wittkover's main contention was that individuals, not institutions, directed the arts, not those impersonal forces that governed Hegel's notion of historical Geist. Wittkover set aside confessional identity. Creative identity now trumped religious affiliation, and was seen as quite separate from institutional patrons. So Wittkover drained religion from the issue. In his generation, especially amongst Jewish art historians who survived World War II, this brand of Cold War individualism was hard won, and it is poignantly in evidence all over art history of the post-war period. There has been no intellectual biography of Wittkover, so I can only piece together what led him to address this topic at the end of his life. The impetus for the conference, which was held in 1969, actually came from Irma Jaffe, who approached Wittkover to co-organize an incredibly well-attended symposium. That he accepted the invitation is not surprising. For decades, Wittkover had been trying to rescue the Baroque in general and the work of Bernini in particular from the derogatory attitudes of scholars. From the time that Bernard Berenson told a young Wittkover that the drawings of Bernini that he wrote the first monograph about made Berenson ill, to his arrival in London in the 1930s, where truth to material sculptors like Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth and critics like Adrian Stokes, supported by centuries of anti-Roman Catholic sentiment, viewed Bernini's theatrical and illusionistic works, Wittkover's main subject at the time, as really unbearable. In light of the enduring antipathy of the Church of England to the Roman Catholic Church, it is not surprising that Wittkover tackled the Jesuit question only once he had left England for the US. I end with Wittkover because it seems like this is the moment that the animating political issues are definitively diffused and set aside. The problem faced by Wittkover's generation was that many art historians thought that ideological taint had killed works of art, and that depoliticization could open us up to the humanistic core of the works. The most remarkable aspect of Wittkover's work on Jesuit art is the absence of any passion, the absence of conflict. In the aftermath of his neutralization of the conflict over the Jesuit style concept, and I would say more recently, there seems to be little appetite for turning up the heat on the Jesuits, quite the contrary. There is a kind of new or ongoing Kulturkampf driven by Catholic sympathizing historians who prefer to keep the subject neutral in order to perpetuate the devotional aims, that is to say, the religion without the interference of confessional politics. Art historical neutrality can also mask a very Catholic position, not just among Catholics. Art history has become very pious in some circles. So what do we lose though, and here I conclude, when the politics around our concepts are quieted? That neutralization closes an access point to their historical vitality. It occludes important channels by which we establish our relationship to works of art. The Jesuit style has for over a century aroused passionate feelings. Why should we shut off that vital tap from art history? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evonne, for that really fascinating historiography of the 19th and 20th century attitudes to the Jesuit style and Jesuit architecture. We now have some time, 15 minutes, we can go over time slightly, for questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, you can either type it in the chat box or you can use the reactions button at the bottom of the Zoom screen and click raise hand to raise your hand. But we have two questions that came in during the lecture. One is from Seppe Bonen. Would you like to switch your microphone and camera on, Seppe, to ask your question?
Yes, hello. Can you see and hear me?
Yes.
Very well. So I knew Jesuits have been banned in different countries, predominantly from the movie, The Mission. But now I am curious, I did not know they were ever banished in Germany. And I did not know that they were opposed against German unity. So I am curious as to why they were opposed to German unity and why they were ever banned in Germany. Thank you.
They were seen as an obstacle to the unification of Germany because the papal, there in the 1860s, the popes demanded absolute loyalty. So Catholics were being asked to choose whether they were going to be loyal to Germany or to the Pope. So this was obviously, a massive problem in the effort to politically unify the country. If you had part of the populace who didn't recognize the head of the German state. So that was a structural, I mean, this was like the incredibly controversial move that was made by the papacy. And the Jesuits were supportive of it. So they became associated with this, real kind of attempt to prevent Germany from unifying.
Can I ask, I know for the Italian unification, there was a struggle between to include the papal states and the Pope not being in agreement with this, but on what kind of issues would the Pope feel threatened by German unity? Would he feel threatened because it would be a Protestant unity?
Well, Germany was, because there was because the government was always located in Prussia, which was Protestant. And because there was a strong Protestant drive to make a unified Germany a Protestant country, right? So if Germany was unified under Protestant or Lutheran Prussia, and they succeeded as they hoped and this is why Germany mounted the Kulturkampf after it was unified, to try to really like wipe out Catholic resistance and create a state religion. So, that's what the Pope in Rome did not want to happen in Germany. In Germany was this big unified country that had a state religion that excluded the Catholics. That was what was being avoided. So so the Catholics were actually very effective in organizing against it. And so at the end, they dropped the Kulturkampf because it failed. The Catholics organized politically. And so this is why Gorlitz's history comes at the end of the Kulturkampf. They realized that Germany was not going to have a state religion in Lutheranism and Protestantism, that they were going to have to live together, right? So his history said, okay, you guys are living in these cities full of Catholic or Lutheran or both churches. They must have been such painful reminders in some places of the presence of Catholics in Protestant places and so on and so forth. I mean, these churches really loomed. So Gorlit was sort of creating a climate of acceptance through the architecture as well, because let's face it, these large buildings become, if you are mad at the government and you live in the capital and you pass by the Capitol. I had a fellowship one year at CASVA, the National Gallery in Washington. My office looked right at the US Capitol. And so you felt that building. You felt the government every day through that building. And I absolutely projected all my views of what was going on inside of it at the building. We all do it. So that was what Gorlit was trying to address, was the feelings about confessionalization by writing the history of architecture.
Okay, thank you very much. I did not know that.
Okay. Sorry, long answer.
Not a problem. We have another question from Caro B. And she writes that whether or not this is ultimately a kind of consequence of the Reformation and the confessional divisions as they were manifested in the Council of Trent and in the Counter-Reformation, and those sorts of religious and ideological oppositions, and that they became the political oppositions that you talked about, and whether or not, to what extent religion and politics can just be equated in this period and with respect to this question.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, to the extent that in Germany, the principle of the prince's religion determined the religion of his subjects. Yes, confessional identity was political, right? If that principle didn't exist, then then politics and religion might have been imagined as separate matters, but they weren't, right? If you lived in a certain zone and the prince decided to go over to Protestantism, you lived in a Protestant principality, and that was the official religion. So yes, this is a long continuation in the modern discipline of art history of confessional politics that started with the Reformation.
Thank you. So does anybody else have a question? As I said, you can type it in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or you can type in the chat that you have a question. You don't have to type out the whole question in the chat. Eleonora.
Hello. Thank you so much for your presentation. Actually, it blew me away, this huge history about the terms and their meanings. And I was wondering actually for some time about other terms. For example, the Counter-Reformation. And I know that it originated a little bit in the same circumstances, or as much as I know. And I was wondering, what is your opinion about this term, and what do you suggest to use? Because today, as much as I know or noticing, there are so many other terms who are meaning also a little bit the same, or also a little bit differently, from Catholic renewal, Catholic Reformation, Catholic Baroque, and so on and so on. But also Counter-Reformation is very common. So
Right.
maybe you could comment on that. Thank you.
I am in favor of Counter-Reformation as opposed to Catholic Reform, because it recognizes the impetus for this particular moment of reform. You can talk about Catholic Reform before Lutheranism, and there were many moments of Catholic Reform, but in the, let's say, post-Tridentine world, after the meeting of the Council of Trent, they were specifically reacting to the Reformation. And so I think actually it's more accurate to refer to a Counter-Reformation at this point. And it's historically more specific to refer to it, because, and I think that we don't, in art history, do not pay enough attention. I think it's happening a little bit more now, to, especially in Italian art history, to what they were worried about the reformers critiquing, looking over their shoulders and saying, hey, the Sistine Chapel was like full of sexy nudes. You know, what about that? You spent a lot of money on that, Mr. Pope. There isn't enough attention paid to, like, there were critiques coming down, and Italian specialists tend to be a little too isolated and not thinking about it. So I would not be tempted to speak about this period as the Reformation, Catholic Reformation at all.
Thank you.
But in any case, whatever term you use it knowingly, right? You can, you know, say, I'm using it in the sense of, or, you know, I'm using it here because it helps me get at this. So, you know, you could even use the Jesuit style. It's a little funny to use it, but, you know, if it makes a point, right? So just be aware a bit of the history of your terms.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question? If not, I wonder if I might ask a question, Evonne, whether or not the figures that you've discussed today, their attitudes towards the Jesuit style, Jesuit architecture, or Jesuit art, but to what extent, either positive or negative, to what extent they align with anything else that they might have written about the Jesuits. And so did they ever formulate any opinion on the Society of Jesus, in addition to Jesuit, you know, their writings about Jesuit architecture, as in any positive or negative sense? So, by which I mean simply, are their views of Jesuit art and architecture aligned with their views of the Jesuits as such, or with the Society of Jesus as such, or is there variation there?
Well, Burckhardt, yes, for sure, right? I mean, he was very anti-Jesuit. So that aligns perfectly with his views of their education system in particular as dangerous, deeply dangerous. Gourlet, I don't know. I suspect that the family history, that the fanatical monk may have been a Jesuit, even though monk would have been the wrong word, but it was a common kind of word. But I don't know, and I there aren't any other writings that I found by Gourlet that touched upon the subject. He was really an architectural critic, and that it wasn't in his wheelhouse to write about the Jesuits. Galassi Paluzzi, I have not read his around in his bibliography much, but he was very aligned with Father Taki Venturi, a Jesuit, and he was very in bed with the Jesuits. So yes, I'm sure it totally aligns with his views about the Jesuits, but I just haven't looked for it. I think it's kind of self-apparent in the book, but that's his view. Hitler, I don't know, I don't care. And Vitkover, you know, Vitkover is such a neutral guy that he writes in a very dispassionate way. I mean, he attributes an important role to the Jesuits in history of art, but outside of art history, I don't know that Vitkover left any traces of his views. And in fact, his wife did a very extensive oral history interview in which she talked about her husband a lot, and the Jesuits never came up. That's Hannah.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, then I would like to thank you, Evonne, very, very much for this really rich presentation, a very informative presentation. Yeah, thank you for your willingness again to deliver this lecture as part of the Jesuit Heritage Summer School. And thank you to all those who participated in it.